You sent us a powerful document this week, the declaration from the Colombian Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence and Non-Repetition. And what immediately struck me was this chilling statistic. Less than 2% of the deaths in this long conflict actually happened in combat.
Yeah.
Think about what that reveals, right? The overwhelming majority. Civilians.
Mm-hmm.
It really forces you to confront the nature of this conflict right from the start.
It really does. And, to give it some context, this declaration, it's a core part of the Great Peace Final Report, which came out in 2022.
Right.
It's basically the result of this huge effort by 11 commissioners. They were appointed after the peace agreement between the Colombian State and the FARC-EP, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army.
Okay.
And their mission, it's really significant, trying to shed light on the truth of this decades-long conflict, to really acknowledge the reality and the deep suffering of the victims, and ultimately to offer explanations, ways to try and stop this kind of violence from ever happening again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's dig into that a bit more. The commission's work, this wasn't just looking at old papers, was it? They talked to the people most affected.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer scale of it is, it's pretty remarkable. They listened to over 30,000 victims share their experiences.
30,000, wow.
Yeah, and they got thousands of reports from all sorts of groups, civil society, human rights defenders, even businesses. Plus, they held over 500 social dialogue meetings, talking to everyone from former presidents to, ex-combatants. This declaration really tries to capture the essence of everything they heard and learned.
So, for our listener, why are we doing this deep dive? What's the real value here?
Well, look, this is a really complex and, frankly, quite heartbreaking piece of history. The Commission's declaration gives us a structured way, a direct path, to understand it from the ground up.
Okay.
Our goal here is to pull out the most critical insights for you, maybe some surprising facts, those nuanced viewpoints, without, burying you in all the data they gather.
Right.
Think of this as your focused lens, getting right to the heart of this key document and, the ongoing, very challenging journey towards peace in Colombia.
So the declaration kicks off with this really powerful statement. They talk about hope, a future for a broken and shattered nation.
Mm-hmm.
But then, boom, they hit you with this universal question, where is your brother? And then the follow-up, the blood of your brother cries out endlessly from the earth. Yeah. It's incredibly impactful.
It is, isn't it? It sets up this strong ethical frame right away. They're not just presenting facts, they're making a deep moral appeal. And that metaphor, they use the nation as a broken body, it's so vivid.
Yeah.
They don't just say the country suffered. They give these examples that really resonate. An infarcted heart in Choco, gangrenous arms in Arauca, destroyed legs in Mapirpan. It paints such a powerful picture of this deep systemic damage everywhere.
And it's not just the physical violence they focus on. They also talk about needing to free the symbolic and cultural world from fear, anger, mistrust, and this point about getting weapons out of politics that really jumped out at me.
That's absolutely critical to their analysis. They identify this war mode of thinking.
War mode.
Yeah, where people with different views are basically dehumanized, seen as enemies. That's a fundamental block to any real progress, they argue.
Because in that mindset, anyone who disagrees is just an obstacle or even a threat.
Exactly. And that, they say, is what allowed these, truly horrific acts to happen.
Okay, here's something I found really fascinating. The commission actually found that acknowledging responsibility can, strengthen your reputation, not damage it. That feels a bit counterintuitive, right?
It does on the surface.
Yeah.
But the point they're making is quite profound, I think. By owning up to the harm caused, people or groups shift, right? They go from being seen as the source of the problem to being part of the solution. It's about facing the truth of the harm, which is vital for the victim's healing, but also ultimately for the moral recovery of those who caused the harm too.
The declaration also points out this huge paradox in Colombia. Incredibly rich in resources, but constantly struggling with these deep-rooted issues like exclusion, massive inequality, racism, corruption.
Exactly.
It's almost like they're saying the potential for peace and prosperity is there, but these structural problems keep getting in the way.
Precisely. They don't see these as separate issues.
Mm-hmm.
They see them as interconnected things that have fed off each other and fueled the conflict for decades. And their final thought in that opening bit is this powerful call to action. We just cannot keep accumulating more shattered lives. There's this urgency to break the cycle and actively build a future together, even with all the differences that naturally exist.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to how the commission worked. They talk about this two-step process for clarifying the truth. Step one is accepting the reality of the victims. What does that really mean?
At its heart, it's about putting the experiences, the suffering of those harmed right at the very center of everything. It demands a complete, unequivocal acknowledgement of the physical and emotional devastation. No trying to explain it away or minimize it. They even quote Pope Francis. Before any speech or sermon, lay your hands on the blood-stained body of your people. It really highlights that need for direct, empathetic engagement with what victims actually live through.
And then step two is seeking the truth that explains why it happened. This is where they get into causes, responsibility, prevention.
Right, exactly. This is the deep dive into understanding who was responsible, how these things unfolded, and crucially, how do we put things in place to make sure they never happen again?
Right.
It also means looking carefully at the roles played by everyone, the state, different groups in society throughout the conflict. What did they do?
Yeah.
And just as importantly, what didn't they do?
You mentioned they went to great lengths to listen to victims. This wasn't just formal hearings in Bogota, was it?
Oh, not at all. They took a really multifaceted, committed approach. They set up these houses of truth in 28 places across the country. They made a huge effort to reach marginalized communities, going to indigenous reservations, Afro-Colombian areas, even reaching out to Colombians living in exile in 24 different countries.
Wow.
They went to indigenous gatherings, mingas, took difficult journeys to remote areas. It wasn't just about collecting data, it was about creating safe, respectful spaces for people to share their truths.
And the sheer range of victims they spoke to. It paints such a devastating picture. Kids forced into war, mothers searching for the disappeared, victims of extrajudicial killings. I mean, the list just goes on and on.
It does.
And even nature itself, scarred rivers used as graves, poisoned forests.
It really hammers home how all-encompassing the conflict was. It touched every single aspect of Colombian life, leaving these deep, lasting wounds on people, communities, the land itself. And it was out of that overwhelming reality that the commission came up with its claim of outrage.
The claim of outrage.
Yeah, this fundamental moral questioning. Why was this barbarity just tolerated, accepted even, as normal?
Yeah.
Why didn't the country demand an end to it sooner?
They really hold up a mirror to all of Colombian society, don't they? Asking tough questions about the state, political parties, armed groups, religious leaders, the media.
Yes.
It's like they're saying there's a collective responsibility for letting it go on for so long.
Exactly. They're challenging the national conscience, really pushing for a deep reckoning with the past and why it was allowed to happen. That claim of outrage is a powerful indictment of how violence became normalized and the failures to protect the most vulnerable.
Wait, let's get into some of the specific, painful facts they uncovered. The disappeared. I mean, that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Over 110,000 people.
Yeah.
That image of women in parks with photos of their missing kids, it's devastating. And it's been going on since at least 1982.
It's a staggering number, isn't it? It represents this immense ongoing suffering for countless families. These women, their dedication, their demand to just know what happened. It speaks volumes about the conflict's brutality and that agony of uncertainty. The commission really highlights the crucial, often dangerous work of the UBPD, the search unit for missing persons, who are working alongside these families.
Then there are the kidnappings. Thousands upon thousands held by different armed groups, the sheer degradation, the constant fear. The commission pleads for the country to really listen to these survivors' stories.
They do. They share some truly horrific examples. The deputies from Valle del Cauca kidnapped and killed, families held hostage in a church, people held for over a decade in terrible conditions.
Unbelievable.
The FARC-EP's public apology and their ongoing participation in the JEP, the Special Peace Jurisdiction, specifically on kidnapping. That's a significant step, though perhaps not enough for some victims, understandably.
And the section on massacres. It's just brutal. Over 2,000 documented massacres. All sides did it, but the majority, grimly, were paramilitaries, often with support or, a blind eye turned by security forces. The names Barranca Bermeja, Bujaya, El Salado, they've become synonymous with horror. And some towns suffered repeated massacres. The countryside turned into mountains and valleys of mourning, as they put it.
The sheer scale, the repetition. It's shocking. And that justification from the paramilitary-linked professor calling atrocities ethical options to prevent something worse. It shows such a chilling dehumanization.
Yeah, it's wow.
The commission asks point blank, why did society witness this day after day and let it continue? Why wasn't basic security provided to people clearly at risk?
And then we get to the false positives. This awful euphemism for young men, lured with fake job offers, then murdered by army members and passed off as guerrillas killed in combat, just to boost numbers. The JEP has documented over 6,400 cases, and the commission thinks the real number could be much higher. The institutional pressure for body counts? It's sickening.
It's a profound betrayal by the very state institution meant to protect people. These weren't just isolated incidents. The commission points to a persistent corporate behavior in the military, fueled by bad incentives, a culture that valued body counts over human life, and the fact it happened while human rights training was supposedly going on. That's deeply disturbing.
It is.
The courage of those inside the military who refused, the judges who risked everything to expose it, it shows there was an internal struggle. But that cry from the victims' families who gave the order, that remains central, demanding accountability right at the top.
Yeah.
Former President Santos's testimony and apology, while important, came long after the damage was done.
The impact on children is another deeply disturbing part. Over 30,000 kids involved in the fighting, on all sides. Forced recruitment by FARC-EP, by paramilitaries, the suffering they endured. That account of a child executed just for trying to escape. And over 1,000 child victims bravely shared stories of subjugation, abuse, forced abortions.
These are stolen childhoods, lives just irrevocably scarred by war's brutality. The commission's effort to listen to them, many now young adults carrying these wounds, shows the lasting trauma. Even the accounts from former child soldiers trying to justify their past. It speaks to the complex psychological impact.
The declaration also tackles the horrific use of bodies as weapons against women and LGBTIQ+ people. Rape, forced abortions, sexual torture used deliberately to spread terror, reinforce patriarchal power. And in some places, it just became normalized, accepted.
The testimonies from women and LGBTIQ+ individuals in Cartagena were a really crucial moment for the commission. Their courage in speaking out, their determination to reclaim dignity and fight for a different future. It's incredibly inspiring. The commission points out how societal prejudice, the normalization of violence against women, created an environment where these atrocities could happen with, disturbingly, a degree of social complicity. These survivors are now vital voices for change.
And the scale of displacement. Another staggering consequence. Millions forced from their homes, their lands, becoming internally displaced or exiles. The struggles of those who resisted, the plight of displaced youth in cities, it's a picture of a society completely uprooted.
It's the wandering crowd, as they call them. Lives thrown into chaos, losing not just homes, but their way of life, their connections, their sense of belonging. And like you said, even those who stayed faced immense danger. It shows how pervasive the conflict was.
Their focus on peasant farmers really highlights the connection between land and the conflict, doesn't it? Displacement, violence, marginalization, the reversal of agrarian reform.
Yes, they see the peasantry not just as an economic group, but as a distinct cultural and political group whose rights were systematically violated. That violent agrarian counter-reform, they describe basically undid decades of struggle for land rights, making these communities incredibly vulnerable.
And the impact on indigenous, Black, Afro-Colombian, Rizal, Palenquero, and Roma peoples. It was disproportionate, and the effects linger. Their connection to territory, historical exclusion, racism, it all played a part.
Absolutely. Their deep cultural and spiritual ties to their lands made displacement and violence even more devastating. The commission stresses how historical injustice and racism created the conditions for dispossession and forced involvement in illegal economies. Having the Ethnic Peoples Directorate within the commission itself shows how vital it was to understand the conflict through their unique perspectives.
And it's so important they also honor those who fought for dignity and peace without arms and were murdered for it. Human rights defenders, judges, prosecutors, unionists, students, journalists, artists, teachers, ethnic and religious leaders.
They call them the true protagonists of peace. People who risked everything for justice and human rights against powerful, dangerous forces. Their murders are a huge loss for Colombia and show the real risks of challenging the status quo.
The image of Colombia as one of the world's most mined countries. It's horrifying. Landmines turning the landscape into a hell.
The indiscriminate nature of those weapons. The impact goes way beyond casualties. It hinders farming, disrupts lives, creates this constant climate of fear. Demining efforts are vital but face huge challenges, especially with new mines still being planted in some areas. It's disheartening.
Lastly, the Commission looks critically at the economic model itself as a driver of the conflict. Deep inequality, land concentration, failure to tax the wealthy, corruption, even the drug trade's paradoxical role.
Yeah, their analysis shows how those fundamental economic inequalities, the lack of opportunity, especially in rural areas, fueled grievances and created fertile ground for armed groups. They also highlight how various economic actors, big and small, got involved, some supporting armed groups, sometimes benefiting from the violence and displacement. That complex interplay between legal and illegal economies is crucial to understanding why the conflict lasted so long.
Now, the Commission didn't just list facts. They had this whole discussion on the explanation. How did they tackle trying to understand why it all happened?
Well, first, they're careful to say they don't own the truth. Their goal was to clarify it as best they could.
Okay.
So the process involved, first, really deeply listening to all those victim testimonies, then thoroughly investigating the wider historical, social, political context around specific events, and then critically evaluating different hypotheses.
Right.
They also consciously tried to bring in diverse perspectives, indigenous and Afro-descendant ways of thinking, plus considering gender and age dimensions.
And they distinguish between just having an opinion and actually explaining the truth, right?
Exactly. They acknowledge that different opinions and ideas are part of the process. They raise questions, offer viewpoints, but they stress you have to rigorously test those ideas against evidence and analysis to arrive at explanations you can state with some certainty.
Makes sense.
They admit historical truth is complex, understanding evolves, but they firmly believe the truth they did uncover demands ethical reflection and, importantly, political action.
So what were some key elements of the explanatory context they identified? They mention a complex framework of factors.
Yeah, their main analysis points to the conflict coming from this deeply interconnected system. It wasn't just one thing. It was a mix of long-standing injustices, the state and elites historically relying on the military for force, the rise of private defense groups that became brutal paramilitaries, and the ongoing struggle over land and resources.
So a whole web of issues.
Exactly. It highlights the roles of state actors, non-state actors, and the damaging impact of corruption and inequality.
And they talk about responsibilities, making a distinction between the JCP's focus on individual criminal acts and the Commission's focus on broader collective responsibility, historical, moral, political.
That distinction is absolutely key. The JEP's vital work is about holding individuals accountable, often through restorative justice. The Commission aims for a wider societal understanding of collective responsibility for the violence.
Like the example they used.
Right, they use the powerful example of Germany acknowledging collective responsibility for the Holocaust. They argue a similar acceptance of shared responsibility in Colombia is crucial for national healing and building a peaceful future.
The historical analysis points to two persistent things in Colombia: weapons in politics, and the idea of the internal enemy.
Yeah, two deeply ingrained destructive patterns. The normalization of using weapons in politics leading to assassinations. Even political genocide, like with the Union Patriotica, is a horrific example. And this pervasive belief in an internal enemy, held by both the far right and far left, fueled distrust, blocked reconciliation, and justified violence against opponents. That huge private security apparatus they mentioned. It's a symptom of that deep societal mistrust.
The war overwhelmingly killed civilians, and all sides committed war crimes. But the Commission notes the army, police, and insurgents weren't initially formed to commit crimes. There was this idea, however complex, of dying for the country or for the people.
They acknowledge the complex motives of people involved, some driven by ideology, others by economic need or opportunity. And they highlight the clashing views on legitimacy. The military seeing themselves as upholding law, guerrillas believing they fought for just change. It just underlines the tragedy of a conflict where so many lives were lost or ruined, regardless of initial intentions.
They pinpoint 1996 to 2010 as the absolute worst period, accounting for 75% of victims. Understanding that hard time is key to understanding the peace process and its challenges, isn't it?
Definitely. That period saw a peak in violations of international humanitarian law by everyone involved. It was also when the FARC-EP heavily invested in the war, and the state, with international backing, pushed back hard. It was a time of immense suffering, but importantly also a time when parts of civil society kept bravely working for peace amid the violence.
And despite the challenges, the no vote in the referendum, the Commission stresses the huge political and ethical value of the Havana peace process. Peace has largely prevailed, and the comprehensive peace system is still active.
They see the Havana Agreement as a crucial, if imperfect, step, even with significant political opposition. And President Petro's stated goal of strengthening peace efforts offers some hope for continued progress.
Okay, finally, the Commission lays out its findings and messages. These are specific requests to different groups: Colombian society, the state, the international community. It's a big call to action.
It really is. They plead with Colombians to reject killing, recognize victims' pain, implement the peace agreement, start peace talks with the ELN and others, deepen democracy and impunity, reform drug policy based on human rights, create a new vision of security for everyone.
Wow, it's comprehensive.
Reject corruption, prioritize equality, recognize peasant farmers and ethnic communities, overcome racism, respect differences, and they ask friendly nations to support reconciliation, not war. Even a call to religious leaders to embrace their mission of reconciliation.
The last point they make is about the huge challenge of reconciliation. They note Colombia's unique situation, ongoing democracy, despite decades of conflict. But the Havana peace deal left deep societal fractures. Yet the message they heard, especially from victims, was powerful. May the blatant truth that you deliver lead us to reconciliation.
And they define reconciliation very practically. It's about accepting the full truth, overcoming denial and impunity, ending violence, accepting shared responsibility, respecting everyone's dignity, and building a state that serves human rights.
Right.
They stress it requires transformation from all sectors, a real shift away from that ingrained war mode towards hope and collective trust.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Declaration, what's the single most crucial takeaway for our listener?
I think the core message is undeniable and urgent. The need for truth to be fully acknowledged, for responsibility to be accepted across society, and for a deep, sustained shift towards real reconciliation. The Commission makes it clear that's the only way to break Colombia's tragic cycles of violence. Lasting peace demands tackling those root issues: inequality, exclusion, the normalization of violence.
It's an incredibly powerful document, but what really sticks with me is just the sheer number, that figure of 10 million victims mentioned in the full report. It's almost impossible to grasp that scale of suffering and that war mode of thinking they identify. It seems like such a deep-seated mindset to overcome. It really makes you think about the profound changes needed for lasting peace, not just in Colombia, but anywhere with deep conflict. What stands out most to you, our listener, and how does understanding a conflict like this, its scale and complexity, shape your own thoughts on societal healing and reconciliation in the world today?